Good day, everyone. My name is Dr. Kristine Peace, and along with my honors student, Matisse Gauthier, we want to share with you some recent data we've collected on perceptions of stalking behaviors. Unfortunately, people's perception of stalking severity, threat, and prevalence often do not align with the true nature and scope of these experiences. Distorted perceptions of stalking may be due, in part, to the lack of clarity surrounding the definition of this crime. In Canada, stalking itself is not a crime, but falls under the offense of criminal harassment. Criminal harassment refers to unwanted, relentless contact with an individual, causing one to fear for their safety. Of note is that harassment is a victim-defined crime, and it is reliant upon the victim to feel victimized. This makes how we perceive stalking behaviors and victim fear even more important to evaluate. Statistical surveys indicate, in general, that stalking is a crime against young persons, aged 15 to 34, and is more likely to occur to women relative to men. That said, these numbers are likely distorted, as stalking often goes unidentified by victims themselves, and on average, only 2 in 5 victims report stalking to the police. Now, there are several factors that influence perceptions of stalking. First, stalking can occur in many different forms and is typically divided according to where the behavior occurs, online or offline. In our study, we separated these into 3 more distinct categories of in-person, phone, and cyber stalking.
In-person stalking is characterized by a range of behaviors that include repeatedly following or harassing another, such as following a person home, to their place of work, or anything that includes unwanted direct face-to-face contact with an individual. Cyberstalking is characterized by repeated unwanted messages through social media, email, or any internet source, and violating personal accounts or information stored online. Finally, phone stalking can refer to unwanted attention in the form of repeated telephone calls and voicemails directed towards a target. We have chosen to use this definition in our research, although phone and cyber stalking are often grouped as online stalking now, likely due to the fact that our phones are also now our computers. Research has shown that online and offline stalking have similar effects on the emotional distress they cause victims and the progression of stalking behaviors. That said, online stalking has been more normalized and accepted and viewed as less serious and malicious in general.
Another influence on perceptions of stalking is the gender of the perpetrator and the victim. Men, relative to women, are generally perceived as being more dangerous and likely to use violence as a means of control. These findings coincide with prevalence rates, as the majority of stalking victims are women. In terms of blame, victims of stalking who are men are more likely to be blamed for their own victimization. However, there's conflicting data indicating that both genders are blamed equally. Third, the relationship between the stalker and the victim also influence perceptions of this crime. In particular, victims who are stalked by former intimate partners are blamed more relative to harassment perpetrated by acquaintances or strangers. Further, this form of stalking is often minimized. In reality, criminal harassment perpetrated by former partners is frequently more dangerous and more likely to result in fatalities. Aside from our variables of interest, we have noticed a disturbing trend where stalkers are viewed as love-struck men pursuing women they are determined to create or maintain a relationship with, and that stalking behaviors are rewarded by either sex or relationships. For example, the popular Netflix series You has been criticized for romanticizing stalking and blurring the lines of criminal behavior, adding to the challenge that victims have in defining these behaviors as problematic. The reality is that stalking is not romantic, it is not okay, and it is a crime.
As such, the purpose of this study was to determine how people's perceptions of stalking are influenced by the following variables: the type of stalking, which was either in person, on the phone, or cyber stalking; the gender of the stalker, where the perpetrator was either a man or a woman; and the relationship between the stalker and the victim, such that they were either former intimate partners, acquaintances from class, or strangers. Our sample thus far includes 894 undergraduate students who read a vignette that depicted a series of escalating harassment behaviors that culminated in threats of violence. All vignettes were controlled for length and heterosexual sexual identity. Following this, they provided a series of ratings concerning severity, victim and perpetrator responsibility, and the necessity for criminal justice intervention. Our first snapshot of stalking concerns our own participants. Within our sample, 30.1% of participants reported that a friend or family member had disclosed that they had been a victim of stalking, and 25.9% of our sample reported that they themselves were victims of stalking. Breaking this down further, of the 25.9%, which was 231 participants, who reported stalking in our sample, women comprised the majority of stalking victims. That said, when you look at the proportion of victims compared to the overall gender category, non-binary persons had a much higher rate of victimization overall. So aside from their own experiences, how did our participants perceive the stalking scenarios they were assigned?
First, let's look at what we found concerning the type of stalking. Not surprisingly, across most of our criminal justice intervention variables, in-person stalking was treated as the most serious, whereas cyberstalking was minimized. Interestingly, initial behaviors associated with cyberstalking were less likely to be classified as criminal harassment relative to in-person stalking. By the end of the vignette, all forms of stalking were deemed as such. This finding suggests that different forms of harassment appear to have different thresholds for what constitutes stalking and when that occurs. That said, while participants failed to recognize cyberstalking as such early on, they were more likely to interpret these behaviors as wrong relative to in-person and phone stalking. Given that criminal harassment in Canada is defined based on a victim's experience of fear, these findings suggest that better intervention methods targeted at younger audiences may help them in correctly identifying the early warning signs of problematic cyber behavior.
In relation to stalker gender, we also found several interesting patterns. Overall, stalking perpetrated by men was rated as more serious and warranting criminal justice system intervention. Again, this finding is unsurprising given the prevalence data. Even a quick Google search of stalking almost exclusively depicts men as perpetrators and women as victims. Men who stalk also were viewed as more likely to harm their victims and follow through on their threats. And victims were rated as more vulnerable, afraid, and likely to get hurt when the stalker was a man. Interestingly, in our data set, being viewed as psycho, mentally ill, or in need of psychiatric help did not differ between men and women stalkers, but was more related to those classified as strangers. However, women stalkers in the media are often portrayed as romantically misguided, a nuisance, or mentally disturbed. The potential for violence is often minimized, and victims are more to blame. In relation to this, our data suggests that when stalkers were portrayed as women, the victims, men, should have accepted their advances, been flattered, and were never in any real danger.
Finally, when we compared stalking perceptions across differing perpetrator and victim relationships, we found that strangers who stalk were viewed as mentally ill or disturbed more often relative to acquaintances or former partners. These ratings reflect the assumption that strangers equal danger. But is that really true? No. Despite their perceptions of strangers, our participants did appear to recognize that the signs of stalking are evident sooner in the former partner conditions relative to the other relation types. We suspect this relates to what we call behavioral familiarity. When we know an individual, it may be easier to distinguish between adaptive versus maladaptive patterns. Unfortunately, many websites geared to identify warning signs of stalking are not overly helpful in detecting stalking by someone that is known to us. This all ties back to the reality that we are more likely to be stalked by someone that we know in some capacity, whether it be an associate or a former partner. But our data revealed a concerning fact that in these groups, people also have a higher tendency to blame the victim when they know their stalker. As demonstrated in this graph, any prior history or association with the perpetrator led to increased victim blaming. That said, it should be noted that our scale was out of 7, so victim blaming still was thankfully quite low overall.
In conclusion, some of our perceptions appear to line up with reality, such that participants were able to identify stalking quite quickly when perpetrated by a former partner and recognize the severity of stalking when perpetrated by a man. However, in other areas, our views of stalking are misguided. For example, we tend to minimize and place blame on victims who are men, as well as dismiss the potential for violence in women stalkers. Further, we fail to identify cyberstalking in its initial stages, and it is not treated seriously enough. Our study reinforces the need for more education and research on stalking, its differing forms, and populations, such as non binary persons, who may be more vulnerable to victimization. On that note, thanks for your attention. And for questions, feel free to contact us for more information on these and other findings. Thank you.